when he was so horrifically killed, I was shocked. And I desperately emailed everyone I knew I had met in the government and outside of government for confirmation that it was in fact true, because my hope was that it was just photoshopped or a horrific warning of some sort. I did not want to believe it had happened.
Did you actually watch it?
No, I did look at the still image to make sure it looked like Jim, but I certainly didn't watch it. No, I have no.
Diane Foley's son, the American journalist James Foley, was beheaded in 2014 by Islamic State. The jihadis, who became known globally as the ISIS Beatles because of their British accents and upbringing, kidnapped James, held him in the Syrian desert, subjected him to torture and starvation, and after 18 months shocked the world with video footage of his murder. Diane Foley received a call from the then President Barack Obama 3 days later to confirm her son's killing, but she'd already found out in the worst possible information that a parent can receive via an image that was sent to her of his barbaric killing. 10 years later, Diane has written an incredibly powerful book with novelist Colin McCann about her son, about her experience of campaigning for his release, and why she decided to meet one of her son's killers. It's called American Mother, and Diane Foley joins me now. Welcome to the program, Diane. I'm so honoured to have you here, and slightly jealous of your experience of writing a book with Colin McCann, who's one of my favourite authors. I think that collaboration came about because James was a bit of a fan of Colin McCann as well.
He was. Colin was sent a photo of Jim reading his book, Let the Great World Spin, when he was reporting from Afghanistan. So he knew of his great talent in storytelling.
And is that how your collaboration with Colin came about?
Well, I never received his attempts to reach me until 3 years ago through a mutual friend at Marquette University who was studying his great novel, Paragon. I was invited to a book club's discussion about the book, and that is how we finally connected and became friends.
Tell me a bit then about your son, James, because I think for a lot of people, he'll be forever just be sort of frozen in that dreadful image that was posted across the world on the internet. But tell us about James when he was alive. What was he like?
Well, Jim was like so many of you who continue his brave legacy, Mariella. He was very concerned about the world and national security and the lives of those who have less freedom than us. And he really felt we Westerners needed to know the stories of people in conflict zones and from around the world. So he really cared about our democracy, our freedom, and really had a compassionate heart for others who have much less and suffer amid conflict.
And do you think, in a way, his interest in those who had less, have less, and suffering conflict was born out of the fact that he had quite an idyllic New Hampshire childhood with you as very much a hands-on parent?
I think so. I think he grew up in the country, middle class family, and a lot of love and beautiful nature near a beautiful lake. So, but his eyes were opened. Certainly in our country, we have areas of great poverty. And when he went away to school at Marquette University, that was near an area of poverty, and that university challenged all students to tutor in the inner city. And Jim continued that um, work through Teach for America and multiple mission trips, if you will, to Indian reservations and working with felons in Chicago. He was drawn to the underdog and wanted to hear their stories and why they were where they were.
And so, how understanding were you when his work finally led him in his 30s into visiting places where terrible conflicts were ongoing, and he was putting his own life in danger. Because I think the kidnap in Syria was not the first time that your son was kidnapped. He was kidnapped in 2011 when he went to Libya.
He was, Mariella. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that he was a freelance journalist. Staff journalists tend to have more protection by their media company, but the bulk of reporting from risky parts of the world are done by brave freelancers. However, as a mom, I really was quite ignorant about the risks they take, to be honest.
So when he was kidnapped in Libya, that must have come as quite a shock to you. And I know that an awful lot of the effort made to get him released was made by his younger brother, Michael.
It was, and many friends, Mariella. I mean, he had a large group of friends who did a website, did social media. Others did research to try to figure out how to reach into Gaddafi's sons, which actually eventually helped us find several people who were key to his release by Gaddafi.
So when he headed off to Syria again, you must have been more worried than you might have been otherwise because of this previous experience. How long had he been there before you heard about his kidnapping?
Well, Mariella, he had been in and out of Syria for about 9 months, nearly the full year. He had been in and out of Syria throughout 2012, kept keeping a low profile and using any and every safety measure that he could throughout that time. So he planned to go back in November and promised to return for Christmas, actually.
And then you received information. How did you receive that information that he'd been kidnapped, and how did you feel at that moment?
We received a call the day after the U.S. Thanksgiving from a dear colleague of his, photojournalist Nicole Tung, saying that Jim had been kidnapped. And we were in shock. We couldn't believe it was happening again. It was a horrible feeling.
You were a practice nurse at your husband's clinic, and I think, I mean, every mother spends her life suffused with guilt about one thing or another. But I know James had called you, or Jim had called you just before Thanksgiving, and you'd been quite busy in your surgery. Was that something that haunted you once you heard that he'd been kidnapped again?
Absolutely, because that is the very last time I spoke with him. And I was busy because I was working and patients were waiting for me. So it was a very brief but wonderful phone call. He was just thoughtful like that. My elderly aunt had just died, so he called to give his condolences and to say he was taking a quick trip into Syria and will be home for Christmas.
Well, that quick trip went on and on because he was taken hostage, and I think it was quite a number of months before you heard anything at all. I mean, were you at that time concerned about whether he was alive or dead? What was your
Abs
sense of what was happening?
Jim vanished. It was totally different than the previous kidnapping in Libya, which had been witnessed by our New York Times reporter, and thus we knew exactly who had him and where he was held. However, this time he disappeared, and the driver fixer had no idea really who had taken him because many foreign fighters were pouring into northern Syria at that time. So he truly disappeared, and we did not hear anything about him being alive until September of the next year, 2013.
And how did you hear that news then?
Well, that was thanks to a very good-hearted Belgian father, Dimitri Bonnet, who had um, gone into Syria to rescue his own young son who had succumbed to some of the ISIS etiology. And he was able to get him out. And when he did, his son said that Jim had been held captive with him. And so he knew exactly where Jim was, and that Jim was, in fact, alive and being held with the British citizen John Canley.
In the intervening year, when you had no news whatsoever, you nevertheless went from being a part-time practice nurse to being a campaigner. I don't think something a role you'd taken on before. Um, how difficult was it for you to get your voice heard? As I understand it, you ran around Washington, being passed between, the U.S. Department of State, the White House, the FBI. How were you dealt with?
Well, I knew nothing, so I was quite ignorant about how to be an advocate in our government. I was rather ignorant about our policy and who were the right people, but I did my best. Um, I was sent in circles. To be honest, our government did not know what to do with me because the reality was at that time in 2012, our country, the United States, had no US hostage enterprise. There was no one who was, in fact, accountable for helping innocent Americans who are kidnapped or wrongfully detained abroad. So they didn't know what to do with me. So they were the kind, in a way, patronizing. The thing that was the most difficult in retrospect is they kept telling me that Jim was their highest priority, that Jim was the highest priority of our government, which in reality was not true because no one was accountable for the effort or to strategize or negotiate at all with the captors.
And also a conflict there because they said that they don't negotiate with terrorists and they don't negotiate over hostages. I think in the end, what you received was an email ransom note. Really, I mean, not with an amount on it, but the fact that they wanted money. They said that they had your son, that he was their friend, and he was being treated well. But had you gone into negotiation with them, were that possible over money, then you would have been performing a criminal act.
Exactly. It turns out our country was not allowed to negotiate because he was held by a group that was considered a terrorist group. And we were threatened much later in 2014 should we dare to raise a ransom ourselves. So the whole thing was quite appalling. They really didn't know how to handle we frantic parents, if you will.
And then the next thing you heard was this horrific killing of your son. How on earth were you able to cope with that? I mean, I think of it now, I think of my 18-year-old son. I just don't understand how you live past that point.
Well, we all are challenged when we lose loved ones. And this has been the biggest challenge of my life. And certainly when he was so horrifically killed, I was shocked. And I desperately emailed everyone I knew I had met in the government and outside of government for confirmation that it was in fact true, because my hope was that it was just photoshopped or a horrific warning of some sort. I did not want to believe it had happened.
Did you actually watch it?
No, I did look at the still image to make sure it looked like Jim, but I certainly didn't watch it. No, I have no. Um, it was just horrible. I was so angry at myself. We had failed as a family to bring him home. I was angry at our government for leading me to believe that they were working hard to bring him home, when in fact they weren't. I was angry at myself for not understanding the policy and the fact that our government didn't plan on ever negotiating for him. So I had so many regrets, Mariella. I was very upset, and had to pray not to be bitter, to try to deal somehow with the loss. And yeah, it was awful.
And it must have been difficult for your son Michael, who again had got very involved in attempting to get his brother released.
It has been so traumatic for our entire family. Jim has had three other brothers and a younger sister. So our entire family was devastated because Jim was the oldest. He's the one that brought everyone together, always great fun and very loved by all. So it was just hugely traumatizing to everyone.
Diane, you've talked about how you felt in the aftermath of his killing, and of course, it's one thing to campaign against the circumstances that led to your son's murder. Very understandable for you to want to entirely invest yourself in that, I'm sure. But what about sitting down with one of his killers? What possessed you to do that, and how did it come about?
Well, obviously, it was a full 8 years after Jim's horrible murder. Um, Cody and al-Sheikh, the two British jihadists, were extradited to Virginia thanks to wonderful collaboration between the British and American government and many good people trying to find a way to hold these men accountable. Um, Alexander Cody pleaded guilty to all counts, and he offered to visit with victims. So I knew Jim would not have wanted me to be afraid. I felt very sure that I had to speak with him, to be honest. I Jim would have wanted me to hear him out. And as a mother, I wanted to tell him who Jim was. So I really prayed for the strength to be able to see him as a human being who had made horrific mistakes. That was my hope.
You're a woman of faith. Did that help when you were face to face with the man who may have been the man who beheaded your son?
Absolutely, without a doubt. To be honest, Alexander was the age of one of our sons. So as a mother of the four sons, it wasn't that hard to see him as a person who had made horrific choices that have ruined his life. I mean, he's lost his freedom for the rest of his life, his citizenship, most likely the opportunity to ever see his young children or wife again. So the whole thing was very, very sad.
And I think remains so in many ways. But of course, it's thanks to your relentless campaigning that American hostages taken today have got a much better chance of being released. As we speak, American dual nationals are being held in Gaza by Hamas. How will their experience, in your opinion, be different from yours?
Well, at least they have people working very hard on their behalf. We currently have a wonderful um, special envoy for hostage affairs at our U.S. State Department. He's been with us over two administrations, both the Trump and Biden, and he is very compassionate towards families and very skilled in working with other nations. In the case of this horrific situation in Gaza, our country has been working with Qatar, Lebanon, Egypt, and of course the Israeli government to try to promote humanitarian channels for both the people who are suffering in Gaza, but also the very vulnerable hostages that are still being held by Hamas. Obviously, very complex. There's nothing sure about anything. The ordeal is horrific for the remaining families. But at least our country is prioritizing it, and we have good people working on it on behalf of those families, which I did not have. We did not have in 2012. So I'm very proud of the strides our country has made. We at least have wonderful people within the U.S. hostage enterprise doing their very best to have the backs of innocent citizens who are kidnapped abroad or wrongfully detained. But again, There's no guarantee, unfortunately. It's a horrific human rights crimes to take people and use them as political pawns in this way. So the other thing the Foley Foundation is doing is working with others within our government and other NGOs and internationally. We must collectively find ways to deter this horrific practice of international hostage taking.
And how does it feel to see others going through what you went through? What would be your advice, I suppose, to hostage families? I imagine that not zooming in too much on the detail of what might be happening is a part of it, and focusing on the bigger picture and getting them out.
Well, it is, but I also think families need a compassion and need companions on their journey, because we're talking about families who have had loved ones held against their will for many years in some cases. I mean, it's horrible with Hamas now because it's so kinetic and only God knows where they are and if they can get out. But we also have cases being held in Russia. We have Paul Whelan nearing 6 years. We have, the Wall Street journalist Evan Gershowitz and Alsu Kamal. I'm not very good with her last name, but who works with Radio Free Europe being
Yes.
held in Russia, China cases, Iran still holding our people. I mean, this is a scourge that for all of the national security of our Western nations.
Mm.
It is something we must take very seriously and find ways to deter the horror of it all.
And Diane, I wonder just finally, when you're doing this work, which you have committed yourself to totally, I'm not sure what your rest of your family feel about that, but I wonder if that's when you feel closest to the son that you lost.
Well, that's a beautiful insight, Mariella, because that is how Jim's legacy of courage and goodness continues in the world. So to me, this is what Jim would have been doing had he survived. So yes, it's very important that his legacy of moral courage and goodness continue, and that we inspire our young people to know that we're counting on them. They need to be encouraged and challenged to make a difference with their lives for others.
Diane Foley, I'm so sorry for your loss, but so inspired by the work you've done. Thank you so much for joining me today. American Mother is out now, and to find out more, you can visit jamesfoleyfoundation.org.